Hey guys, so today what we're going to do is we are going to be interviewing Zekler from Adherent Apologetics. He's on YouTube, he's on pretty much on every social media platform you can look at and find. He's a young guy, he's in college, but he's very sharp, and we just want to interview him and talk to him and find out how he answers and how he deals with a lot of questions that Christians receive and apologists receive, and just hear his response. So stay tuned. Find out in this video coming right up. So we are just going to dive right in. I guess just first off, introduce yourself.
Sure. So my name is Zekler. I have a YouTube channel / podcast / platform on everything called Adherent Apologetics. And what we do is we just look at the intellectual side of Christianity, and we talk about a lot of things like arguments for God's existence, the resurrection, big theological questions, all kinds of stuff. So we do all kinds of fun things, examining these big questions and talking to people who are a lot smarter than myself. And yeah, so thank you for having me on, Richard. Should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, the first time I actually ever saw you was on Germania. I saw you doing an interview with him. And so, because me and him, I call him my friend. I don't know him personally, but I just saw a couple of his videos and I'm like, nope, that just don't sound right. So I just started commenting and he actually started commenting back. And, the craziest thing is, and I'm not saying this about all atheists, but for some reason, a lot of his followers, and me and him are going to actually have a discussion, I think, in about a week or two, but a lot of his followers, like at the end of my little comments to them, I actually have to tell them, I'm like, you might want to seek psychiatric help. Because like one of my last podcasts was about rape, about how, does God condone rape? Because I'm sure you've heard people like, oh, God wants to rape women to marry the rapist. And I'm like, no, that's not what it says. But, and I went into the great detail about it. And actually, there's this one specific guy, I won't mention his name right now, but he literally sits there and told me just today on a comment that the guy didn't ask to be born. The guy didn't make his own mind. God made his mind. So therefore, rapists are not at fault when they rape women. And I literally just all I could say was, I was like, that's the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. And you need psychiatric help. I'm like, I don't beat around the bush. And a lot of people don't know how to take that with me because I'm like, I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm not one of these people that I don't care if you're offended. That's just my opinion. I've always been that way. I'm like, if you're offended, you're offended. If you're not, you're not. But it just doesn't, if it doesn't make sense to me and if it just sounds idiotic, I'm going to say it. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But that's probably why it's taken me so long to get noticed everywhere because I'm just pretty blunt on things. So how did you get into apologetics?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So it's kind of in short, what happened was is I grew up in kind of like a Christian home my whole life and just kind of lived my life and was, more like probably like a cultural Christian. And then, just doing the thing. And then after my sophomore year of high school, someone I knew passed away in a car crash. He just graduated and he was actually headed to the university that I attend now, Liberty. And it's just for the first time in my life, I really started to think about like these really big questions, like, like, is this person, is he in heaven? Is there a heaven? Like, is there a God? Is Christianity true? Like, what about Islam and Judaism and all these other worldviews? So that kind of got me interested in like my head churning on these big questions. Took some time, thought about it, and I headed into my senior year of high school about a year later and had to do this big senior project. And I was like, not really sure what I wanted to do. But then I realized that one of the most interesting things to me was just what's true about like, these big worldview questions. And I just really didn't know. Like I thought Christianity was true, but I hadn't really examined it. So then I examined these worldviews. I didn't know what apologetics was until I started doing this project. And I read a few different books. Like I read like I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist and Case for Christ More Than Carpenter, like all the classics of like apologetics. And I really became convinced that this Christianity stuff is true. And that through that project. And then I gave my life to Christ. And that's the short of it. And I just grew from there. The platform Adherent Apologetics sort of came as like a branch from that senior project I did, and it's grown into something bigger, and just amazed by everything that's happened since then. So that's a little bit about how I've gotten into like apologetics and these big questions and such.
I forgot to unmute myself. So, like I said, I got this coughing spell, so I'll try to mute it when you're talking, so that way if I do cough, it doesn't interrupt you. But yeah, my story is kind of like the same, I guess, almost. I grew up in a Christian family. I say, well, everyone except for my father. My father, my mom and dad were married till he passed away about, let's see, it was 10 years ago now. And I was a Christian, but I wasn't a Christian, I guess you could say, for maybe all the right reasons. I mean, I was a Christian just because I was told this is who Jesus is, this is what he did. And I always tell people I thought I was a Christian. And the reason I say that is because I believed that Jesus existed. Kind of like Frank Turk says all the time, there's a difference between believe that and believe in. Always believed that he existed, always believed that he died on the cross, but I never put my faith into him all the way. And then when my father passed away 10 years ago on his deathbed, I just asked him, and then my father was a very, very quiet man. Probably all my years of my life, we might have spoken a handful of times. He was just quiet, just sat there. And I just asked him, I said, look, this doesn't look good. And I'm like, so I need to know, do you know who Jesus is? And all he did was look up at me and said, what's between me and God is between me and God. It's none of your business. I said, okay. So I left it alone. And then after that, for some reason, kind of like you, I just started thinking, I'm like, well, why do we believe in Jesus? Like, other than faith and being, this is how it is, I want to know why. And so, and I was like you, I didn't know what apologetics were exactly. But I was doing apologetics before I knew what apologetics was, because I was constantly YouTubing Christian versus atheist and creationism versus evolution. And so I just really got into it, and I really, really liked it. So out of all the evidences for God, what do you think is the greatest evidence for God?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Because I think it's almost kind of hard for me to like just choose one, because I think I look at it as kind of like a cumulative thing. I think there's a few things. I find the idea of personal experience really like an interesting place to start. Just because I think that a lot of times we get this idea that, especially like I'll hear from like skeptics and stuff, where we kind of have to prove that God exists or something along these lines. And it seems like to me, like at least to like most people over time, it's just seemed very evident that God exists. And a lot of people have claimed out like personal experiences, whether it's like healings or providence or things along these lines. So I always think that like personal experience is a really good place to start, because it seems like across all cultures and most of time, most people have believed that God exists. And I don't think that proves it, but I just think it carries a lot of evidential weight, at least in my opinion. And then from there, I think there's like really good like logical arguments. I'm really like a big fan of contingency arguments, especially like getting to like a first stage, like where we can kind of like establish that there's some sort of like necessary grounding to all contingent realities, such as like you and me, Richard. So I like the contingency arguments. And then from there, I think there's really good things like design, because I think especially with like regards to like fine tuning, it seems obvious, like objective beauty, moral knowledge. There's all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of fun arguments that we can dive into and talk about, because there's a lot of things. So yeah.
Yeah, there's, and I'm the same with you. Like when people ask me the same question, they're like, what do you think the greatest argument is? I'm like, if I was an atheist, if I didn't believe, I'm like, I couldn't have someone just tell me one thing and I'll be like, oh, okay, that's true. It's like you said, it's everything added together. It's just kind of like, you can't deny all of this. At some point you got to be like, this ain't a coincidence no more. This is a reality. These are facts and everything else. But what do you think is the greatest evidence against there being a God? And like, how do you combat that? Like, how do you come back at them? Like, well, you got a good point.
No, yeah, this is interesting. because you can almost like with like the greatest evidence against God, like there's some theists that would be like, yeah, well, there's this evidence against God and we can't really combat this, but we think the evidential weight for the arguments for theism is greater. So I don't really know where I stand on that, but probably the best argument against God would probably be something along the lines of either like some sort of like the version of problem of evil with like animal suffering, or like the simplicity of naturalism, like Graham Oppy's naturalism. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but I'd probably go with like something like animal suffering, because I think that it's something that is just very apparent, and it's something it seems seemingly just very obvious to be in our existence. Like, like animals suffer, and there's all kinds of death among these species. And how do we answer that? Well, it's a really tough problem to answer, and I don't know if I can like debunk the problem of animal suffering in a short interview here. But then like a few of the things I kind of think about with like animal suffering is, one, we don't really know how much pain animals can actually experience. Like we run into this with like our own with like the argument from consciousness, where we can't experience someone else's consciousness. Like I could map out your entire brain, Richard, but I could never know what your conscious experience is like. So I think it's in a similar lines with like animal suffering. I think it's apparent that animals suffer. We just don't really know to like what degree do animals actually suffer. Like are they conscious? Are they just like kind of like wired and like DNA and like computers almost? Like we just don't know. So that's one thing. And then I think about, there's interesting ideas. Like I read this paper by Josh Rasmussen and someone else. And they talk about how God could be potentially using animal suffering and stuff from the past is kind of like this providential guiding to bring into this new creation, where we have this. I'm framing this argument really poorly, so I'd highly recommend people check out this paper if you're curious. But it's kind of like this idea of, they're saying like, what if evolution is true? And what they would say is, okay, so we have this like material, and we have the Big Bang, and there's arrangements like rearrangements of this material, and it's progressively becoming something more beautiful, and as the Christian idea of like new creation and such. So it's kind of like they're suffering, but it's going to be redeemed. So that's kind of like a second theodicy, and there's a bunch. My friend Caleb, the Dry Apologist, he's done a lot of good work on animal suffering, and there's a lot of great resources out there. So that's like a couple things on how I like combat the problem of animal suffering. So yeah, there's a lot that we could talk about there.
Yeah, that is crazy. Actually, I've never heard, um, well, anyone's ever brought up to me about animal suffering, but that is a really good point. I'm gonna have to like really look into that now, because I've never really thought about it.
Yeah.
Probably one of the biggest things I've ever had was just here recently, and it was that guy I was telling you about, and he says, "So why would God?" He goes, "I understand your point." He was talking about to me about my point about God giving us free will. He goes, "But you're telling me that God will allow a rapist to have free will to rape a child, but he won't help the child out with their free will because they're not having a choice." And I'm like, I'm gonna have to comment back on that one here in a minute, because I don't have to think about that one. I was like, that's a good one, man. I'm like, there's so much evil just in the world in general that, and what's sad is, we don't have the answers for everything.
Mhm.
Any kind of apologist doesn't have the answer for anything, because the Bible says that his ways are so much higher than ours, and his knowledge is so much higher than ours. And so I can't explain why he does everything he does. And so unfortunately, and I think apologists, their biggest downfall is sometimes they just have to say, I don't know,
Mhm.
because we don't. I mean, we can give you theories, but we really don't know. And it's probably not going to theory that's going to really make you feel any better about the subject. But
Yeah.
I mean, it just is what it is. But like even atheists have to say, I don't know sometimes. Like when you ask them, well, how did the beginning of the universe begin? Well, we don't know.
Mhm.
So it's like, apologists can jump all over that, just like they can jump all over us on certain things too.
Mhm. I think that with like especially with the problem of evil, like I don't think we have this like robust, like where we understand everything and we have these easy answers to the problem of evil. But the way I kind of look at it is like I think most people would agree like a logical problem where you'd say like God and suffering is just totally incompatible. They'd agree that those problems kind of fail, and then we're just left with these kind of theodicies which would say, hey, other things being equal, here's some possible reasons why God may allow for these sufferings. And you like on the face, you could be like, okay, well, maybe these work maybe these don't, but I don't know. It just, it could just be that and we're left 50-50 or something like that. But then I think when you get on to all these other arguments and personal experience and such, it seems like the evidence for God's existence is just so much greater than the evidence against God's existence. So that's kind of the way I kind of think about this.
Yeah, I do. I agree with that completely, and that's pretty much what I turn back to. Is
Mhm.
I think Frank Turk's the one. Well, I mean, I'm sure somebody else has said it before, but Frank Turk for me is the one that just kind of made it famous. Is when he said that evil is kind of like the sun shining. I don't know if you've ever heard him talk about that. How you can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good. It's kind of like the sun
Mhm.
shining. You can have the sun shining without shadows, but you can't have shadows without the sun shining. And so I kind of always go back to that. So the first
Mhm.
time I saw you, like I said, was on you were doing an interview with Germania.
Yeah.
And he was, and I was actually watching it live when y'all were doing it. And I don't know if you could have seen my comments, but I was commenting all
I
to
don't
him,
think I
all.
was following along too much,
Oh
but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I was commenting all along there. But he had mentioned evolution, and you said that
Mhm.
you were open to the idea of evolution.
Mhm.
My question, what I was trying to ask on the YouTube video then was, is in what retrospect are you talking about evolution? Like as in
Mhm.
humans evolving from stardust to like macro evolution, or are you talking about micro evolution where basically a chihuahua can become a wolf?
Yeah. Well, I would say I'm open to like macro evolution, I guess you would call it, where like it's just kind of like what like a someone like a full-fledged person that would hold the theory of evolution would hold. Like I'm open to it. Obviously I think there's a lot of like weird questions and things like on the scientific frame where I don't really understand. Where it's like how do we get different species from like original species? And I'm kind of like at that point I'm like, well, I'm just not a biologist and I haven't studied these things, so I don't really know. So let's think my position on the evolution is like, well, if they came out tomorrow and they had this like undisputable proof that like macroevolution is the real deal, it's done, it's sealed, it wouldn't really change anything for me. Maybe it'd be rule out some like interpretations of like maybe like Genesis or something. So in that sense, I'm open to evolution in terms of like it wouldn't really change like my faith at all. But then in terms of like the science of it, I just really don't know because I haven't studied it, and it could just be a bunch of hogwash, and I'm missing out on that. But I don't know. So that's kind of like my position on evolution. I hope that helps you.
Yeah, I got it. I got it. I guess I just I agree with micro evolution. I
Hmm.
just don't see how ever that, and I mean, and I'm not a scientist at all, but
Hmm.
the way I look at it is if I could let this dog live for 10 million years, I just don't see how this dog would ever turn into a cat or a bird or a different kind of creature. Now, I think it could stay a canine and maybe just evolve, but it'll always be a canine. That's
Hmm.
just mine. And I think it was Michael Behe. I think it was Michael Behe that said that he did a lot of research into epigenetics, and he was saying that it's impossible for it to go down so far.
Hmm.
So he was like, "There's no way with their macroevolution could ever actually happen because epigenetic information can only go so far in DNA." And
Hmm.
so I'm just like, well, I'm
Yeah,
like,
it's interesting. There's a lot of things that are just kind of mysteries. And I think if you're going to be an atheist and follow that through, evolution is kind of like the only cards you have left in terms of like explaining human origin. So it's an interesting topic to think about for sure.
yeah. In fact, I'm in the middle of writing a book, and I cannot pronounce these people's last names. I still have to look at it to read it, but it's a husband and a wife, and they're teachers at some college. And in my book, I wrote down what they said because they literally believe that everything that we know as the universe could be basically like a 14-year-old's science fair project on another galaxy or another
Hmm.
universe. And I'm just like, okay, that's some really good sci-fi movie. I'll
Hmm.
roll with that. I love sci-fi movies. I'm like, but I can't sit there, and follow that along and be like, no, no, I'm
Hmm.
not part of a science fair program. I'm not, but it's a total nother discussion with these people. Like,
Yeah.
I could probably write an entire book about these two. They have the craziest ideas.
Hmm.
Like they literally, I think in one place they said that the stardust that made us with the left hand could be different, the total different star that's on my right hand. And I'm like, I mean, to me, that just sounds so far out there. I'm like, that just takes so much faith to believe that when you don't have proof of it. You know,
Mhm.
that just takes so much more faith than just to sit there and say, somebody designed this. I mean,
Mhm.
it's that simple. To me, it is at
Yeah.
least.
Mhm.
But have you personally ever had like any kind of training in college or anything in like apologetics, theology, philosophy, cosmology, anything?
I have not. I mean, I go to a Christian college, so I've taken a couple like basic like theology or like New Testament, Old Testament studies classes. But then not really in terms of like apologetic stuff. It's just kind of been reading or interacting with like skeptics and stuff. Listening to YouTube videos or debates or podcasts or things like that. But yeah, it's just kind of been a growth and something I just have kind of always done on the side. So nothing professionally yet, maybe for grad school and such, but I mean, no, nothing professional, but it's just a lot of fun to think about. And I'm sure you'd agree, Richard.
Oh, I do. I do. I enjoy it quite a bit, honestly. I'm constantly researching new stuff, and anytime I hear, and it's bad probably because I probably give a lot of atheists a lot of YouTube views because I look up a lot of just random atheists and I just want to see what their arguments are, you know, what they're
Hmm.
trying to claim. And I usually go on there and start trying to comment and seeing if they want to debate or anything else and just go from there. But yeah,
Yeah.
no, it doesn't matter, you know, how you learn it. I just didn't know if you had any plans on being like the next John Lennox or Frank Turek or, you know, if you
Uh,
wanted to pursue something like that in career or
Only the Lord knows. I mean, I'm open to it if the door's open. So I don't have a plan yet in terms of what's going to happen with my life. So it's just kind of trusting God and working my hardest at whatever I do, and we'll see what doors open. So who knows where we'll be 15 years from now.
yeah, you actually remind me of the total opposite of Alex Connor. Do you know who that is?
Yeah, the cosmic skeptic. Hmm.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, because y'all are both young and everything else. Except for he goes this way, you go that way.
Hmm.
So I was just kind of curious on where you're on that. So I
Yeah.
know when you were on the YouTube video for Germania, he mentioned about his, and I laugh because to me it's just crazy. It's disturbing almost that he was saying that Christians should support abortion because children are
Hmm.
innocent and babies are innocent and they're not sin. So let's just kill them. And I literally had told him just point blank, I'm like, so you're telling me that you're comfortable with taking all the babies and all children under the count of uh, under the age of accountability, putting them in the middle of town square and just pulling the trigger, shooting them all in the head. And
Hmm.
he was like, yeah, yeah, if Christianity is true. And I'm just like, that's disturbing to me. I'm like, that's very disturbing. I'm like, because even as a non-Christian, you know, and I got friends that are atheists. I got a lot of friends that are atheists, and not a one of them would be like, no, I'm not okay with killing babies or children. I mean, that's just not normal. And I'm like, exactly, that's not normal. But what is your stance on that? I mean, I'm just curious on what your stance was on it.
Yeah.
Because I ended up having to go off of the video because I was at work on my lunch break when I started watching this. So I had to like take
Yeah.
off and get back to work. But I never saw what your response was, but I did see him try to bring it up.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Because if we're gonna use like a free will defense for like the problem of evil, then you kind of can like point to like the unborn and be like, well, then they don't get a chance to exercise their free will or something. I think one of the things is the question assumes that life's just like about escaping hell. But that's in a sense like yeah, that's part of like being a Christian and being salvation is like escaping death and like knowing Christ. But the big thing is like in knowing like becoming a Christian is about is experiencing a relationship with God and fellowship with him. Like the Christian life isn't just about trying to like, oh, I place my salvation in him, I'm free from hell and I'm done. Like that's just not like if you read like Romans 6, that's not what the Christian life is about. The Christian life is about entering fellowship with God and things like that. So I think from like the beginning the question is kind of has the wrong like idea kind of like about what the purpose of life is. um but like even that being said, then you get into like things like so let's say like if we accept like an Orthodox Christian belief that all the unborn who pass away or maybe like before the age of accountability, they just go to heaven, and they just go to heaven and that's that. So why don't we just kill everyone? Because then everyone would go to heaven. One interesting response to this is like the Molinist response, where we'd say, well, God creates this world where he foreknows that every person that was unborn or dies before the age of accountability, these are people who would freely choose to follow Christ. Or follow God, like if you're gonna like accept like general revelation or things like that, if they're like in some remote tribe and there's like a miscarriage or something. So that's kind of like another way I kind of look at it is where it's like the Mullins perspective, like where if that's really like every unborn person is saved, I'd kind of think that like these are all people who would freely choose to go to heaven if or to follow Christ or follow God if they had the opportunity in this life. So when we're killing them, we're actually killing someone who would have been a follower of God. So I almost think it makes the problem even worse in terms of like killing them. So that's a couple like thoughts I have on that really challenging question because I think it's a really important thing. So yeah.
Yeah, the only response I could really come up with, honestly, was a couple of them, and my response was basically that first off, you can't kill the image of God. I'm like, because I told him I was like, if you're assuming the Bible is true, then that means you're a Christian, and that you would know that you cannot kill the image of God. And of course, he brings up the fact of, well, God killed people. And I'm like, well, no, technically, God can't kill people. See, because if he's the father of all of us, he just moves our location. He just either, takes us to heaven or moves us to eternal hell. I was like,
Mhm.
and I don't like to use the word hell anymore, but I do, and I don't. I do because I think it scares people, but I don't because when I tell people hell, they're like, oh, God sends people to hell. And I'm like, no, not technically. He just loves you so much, he lets you stay without him because you didn't want to be
Mhm.
with him anyway.
Yeah.
But and I told him there, I'm like, so when God takes a child's life or a person's life, he's just moving their location. I'm like, but he's
Mhm.
their father. I'm like, it's just kind of like me going to one of my kids, which all my kids are grown now. But if I was to go to one of my kids' friend's house because they were staying the night, and I'm like, no, it's time for you to come home now. I can force my child to come home with me. There's nothing nobody can do about it. I was like, but now if I go to that same people's house and I try taking their child, I get arrested. I was like, it's kind of the same thing. You're not their father. No, we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, but we're not their father or their mother. So I'm like, I can't tell them when it's time to go home. That's not
Mhm.
my job. That's the father's job. And so that's the way I combated it. I don't know. I could be wrong. But that was just the way I saw it. But you're right. It is a challenging question. It is a good question. But at the same time, to me, it's still disturbing because I'm like,
Oh yeah.
and I think I even told him at one point, I'm like, you do realize this is almost the same mindset as Adolf Hitler. I was like,
Mhm.
Adolf Hitler said that these people were a problem for society, so he got rid of them. You're just saying this is better for them, so let's get rid of them. I'm like, there's
Yeah.
not much of a difference there, buddy. I'm like, you might want to, and I use that a lot. I tell people that a lot when they say stupid things to me. And I told him, and I like him, and I'm not saying I like Romania quite often, and I like the other guy I was talking to. Me and him still chat back and forth. But if you say something that's just idiotic or stupid to me, I'm going to tell you that's just the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And Germania, that's how me and him first started interacting was because of that video. And he was like, "Well, let me just explain my process." And he was trying to comment to me, and I just interrupted him, and I'm like, "There's no explaining that, man." I'm like, "You just
Mhm.
literally said you want to kill babies and children."
Mhm.
No, I'm like, "I really hope a cop ain't watching this." I'm like, "They might be arresting you soon." I'm like, "That's crazy."
I think that like if I step into his shoes, I could understand like if for you're thinking that life is just about escaping hell, um, maybe then if you just kill like the unborn or like young kids or something, then you're just helping them escape hell and they don't have to like worry about that later. But then I think it's just kind of like if Gurr ever became a Christian, you kind of understand that life is not just about escaping hell, but actually entering into fellowship with God. And there's things like the Mullins perspective to like this question where it'd be like, okay, well, this is actually something that's just obviously wrong. And I don't think that like if he, I don't think it's like a very rare person to actually think that what like what's happening was something that actually should be done. I think it's kind of more like a point he tries to make instead of like something he would actually like. Hopefully, something he would actually would do if he wasn't if he was a Christian.
I like that the way you brought that up though. That was pretty good. I'm gonna have to use that sometime about how you're right. He's looking at it as in just heaven or hell. Let's send them to heaven instead of seeing it as a relationship with
Mm-hmm.
Jesus himself. I like that. That's a good point. I never
Thanks.
brought that up. Maybe I should bring that up sometime. That's a good one.
I hope it is.
So it is. So do you ever get approached about people that sit there and talk about slavery?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can we
Yeah.
follow a God that condones slavery? So, how do you approach that? Like, I literally just did a podcast on it last week, but I'm just curious on how your approach is
Yeah.
to that.
It's a interesting question because I think that we're starting in the wrong place. When we're talking about like slavery, especially like regards to the Old Testament, because I'll see this like I'll respond to like atheist stuff on my TikTok a lot. It's like, oh, well, the Bible supports slavery or something like this, and I just kind of wonder, like, why do we start there? When like I think like in the Christian life as a Christian, we start with Christ. And you see someone who's fully man, fully God, walking the earth. And he says things like love the neighbor as yourself. He's the perfect sacrifice for our sins. He does all these beautiful things. So I'm kind of like, when I think about these like questions like slavery, I just start with Jesus, and I'm like, well, what would Jesus do? And I'm not here to like undermine the Old Testament because I don't think that's true, but I think we just do need to understand, like, as a Christian, um, like, it's about Jesus. Like, the question's about like, is Christianity true, or does God exist, and does Jesus rise from the dead? And I don't really see how slavery impacts either of those two questions in the Old Testament, because it's not like, I don't know. And so I just like, I think we start in the wrong place. And it's kind of like, it seems like it's like, oh, there's this easy point where we can go beat up the apologist. And it's like, I just don't, I'm just like, why are we starting there? It doesn't seem relevant to like the questions we're asking. Cause like, worst case scenario, let's say that there's this passage in the Old Testament and you don't like how um the slavery system worked, or the servitude system worked, and you don't like it. Okay, well, if Jesus still rose from the dead, then it doesn't really matter if you don't like it, because what's true is what's true, and we should prefer what's true over what we want to be true. So like, there's that whole thing where I just think we're starting in the wrong place, and it's not really relevant to the whole like, is Christianity true discussion. But then, there's a lot of people like Paul Copan and great scholars that have done work on these questions, and a lot of these passages aren't really what skeptics make them out to be. But I mean, there's things where we're like, well, what's going on here? And it doesn't make sense. We also have to understand we're dealing with a culture 3,000 years before us. It's a lot different. The way they treated other people is a lot different. So there's a lot of things here, but I just like, overall, I don't really see the relevance in terms of like to the truth claims of Christianity.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because what I was bringing up in my podcast was that basically, the Hebrew word for slavery back then was ebed, ebed, or pronounced eved, eved. And I was like, I looked up the definition, and it can mean servitude or slave. It can mean either or.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I tell people, I'm like, what's different really, if you really boil it down to what did they do different then than what's going on now? I'm like, we're all servitude. We're all servants to someone. I mean, if you
Mm-hmm.
have a job, you're a servant. That's just all there is to it. You do what they tell you to do when they tell you to do it, and they give you pay for it. I was like, and a lot of people like to bring up, they're like, oh, well, right here it says that they can sell their slaves and buy slaves. And I'm like, well, if you watch sports, they do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
They sell their players, they buy players, they have contracts with these players. These players just can't leave when they want. I'm like, there's really no
Mm-hmm.
different. I was like, the only thing is back then they didn't have players, they didn't have employees, they didn't have employers. They had masters, and they considered them slaves. I'm like, but I was like, it wasn't a slave. It wasn't like the chattel slavery we know in America. I was like, it was
Mm-hmm.
servitude. I was like, a lot of it actually, if in many places, well, at least one place, it says that if a lot of times the servant wanted to stay with his master, so he stayed after his 6 years of
Mm-hmm.
service and everything else. But yeah, I just think it's ridiculous. And then, like, I had this one lady on Instagram. She was arguing the fact that you know she was saying that she wants to know why God never just came out and said, "Don't have slaves. It's
Mm-hmm.
wrong. Don't do it." And like I told her, I'm like, what difference would that have made? I'm like, God said don't murder, people do it. God said don't commit adultery, people do it. God said all these things, but we all do it. I'm like, so what would it matter if you would have said it? I'm like, people, you would get the same results, and of course she was talking about, in America, how a lot of Christians that were racist, that claimed to be Christians, would use the Bible to enslave, African Americans. And I'm like, you can't blame God for the way people interpret it. I mean, even if he said don't have slaves, I'm like, they could have found a way around that. I mean, there was no stopping it, but it is what it is, I guess.
Yeah.
So, being a Christian, you have to believe in miracles, because without miracles, you wouldn't have the resurrection.
Mhm.
So, when other religions, where people bring up how other religions have miracles, like, why do they have miracles if they're not following the same God we're following?
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
have you ever had that approach before? Have you
Yeah.
somebody ever talked
It's
to you?
It's an interesting question. I was talking with Ken Fish. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he does a lot of like healing like clinics and stuff. Like he's a healing person, but he also is like an Ivy League graduate. He's a really interesting guy. And I asked him about like, well, what do you think about like you claim that miracles have happened in your healing tours and what's not like what about other religions? And he's willing to accept, yeah, I think these things happen in other religions as well. So I'm personally not against miracles and happening against other religion because I think we have to address it at a case by case basis. Like, are we talking about um, a Muslim like being healed, or like a Buddhist like experiencing like some sort of sense of the divine? Like, what are we talking about? Because like when we're looking at like the resurrection, we had this clear miracle where it's like, well, if this happens, like God raised Jesus from the dead, then Christianity is true, and like in Christ the atonement for our sins and such. Like, this is a clear and obvious miracle, like what it means. Whereas like if there's like some miracle like among Muslims, like what does this mean? It just means to me like, okay, well, there's this supernatural force um, that kind of intervened, and like, well, what if it's just a demon? Because like as Christians, we believe in demons and things like that. So that's why, like with like arguments from personal experience and stuff, I don't really know if I can get them to Christianity because of like different experiences in other religions. I just think they're really good evidence for like the existence of a God. So both like in short with other religions, I just kind of think that sure, it's totally possible that they happen, and it almost might be expected given certain interpretations of like Christian theism. So I'm open to it. I don't really see like unless like we're talking about like, well, here's this evidence that Muhammad had this miracle that shows he's the final messenger of God or something like that. Like that'd be a little bit different than like some healing happening somewhere, if you kind of get what I'm saying.
Yeah, I agree. I tell people all the time, I'm like, do other miracles happen? And I really don't get that question a lot, but when I do, I tell them I do believe that people can perform miracles. Absolutely.
Hmm.
I'm
Yeah.
like, because even in the day of Moses, when he was going to Pharaoh, I mean, they were doing the same
Hmm.
things he was doing.
Yeah.
So I'm like, obviously, witchcraft is real. Obviously, like,
Hmm.
and when I say magic, I'm not talking about illusionist, like David Copperfield. I'm talking about real magic. I'm like, yeah, it's real. I'm like, because I mean, the devil's the prince of the world. So yeah, he can do a lot of things here
Yeah.
too,
And if we have miracles from other religions, we're adding evidence to theism almost. Like if we have these like good reasons to think these miracles are happening in other religions, it may like give reason to question or think about Christianity. But it's adding evidential weight to theism. So I don't really know. I that's just kind of like my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I never thought about that, but yeah, that's a good point, because if these other religions, if they're performing miracles, well, now you're just giving a stronger proof that there is something out there. Atheists claim there's nothing out there. Well, you're claiming there's something, because these other religions are doing things too. So what are they doing?
Yeah.
So what do you think is the most prevalent evidence that Jesus of Nazareth was actually resurrected from the dead?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Um, because I'm a lot more convinced by like the existence of God evidences than like the resurrection evidences. I don't know why, but I've just always been drawn to philosophy, so I think about them more. I think just the person of Jesus. Like I think about this idea that like at the center of Christianity isn't just like another person or like a set of laws, but it's like God himself as a person. Like it just seems like the most magnificent story you could come up with, where you have God who creates the universe and allows for these evils to occur, but then he comes into the flesh and experiences these evils and these sufferings. Um, And it's just, it seems almost like too good to be true, where we have this like beautiful story. So I almost think that's the best evidence, because I just don't know how you make this up. But then like we have these things like the disciples' martyrdom, or like the strong attestation of the authorship of the Gospels, or all these other kind of evidences. Like why would you put the women as the first people to discover the tomb? Like we have all these other things that support this idea that the Gospels are like historically reliable documents. And it just seems like to me like I don't really see any other good like hypotheses about kind of like contrary like explanations about how Christianity kind of like grew, like hallucinations or stolen body or all these things. They don't seem to work. The only thing that could seem to work to me is like a legend hypothesis, but it seems like there's just too strong of attestation of the Gospels and things like that for the legend hypothesis to be true. So a few different things I kind of threw. I kind of cheated and gave you more than one. But that's kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, that's my thing too. I think, how we were talking about at the beginning, like what's your greatest argument for God? And you were saying, well, there's many, it's all of it added up together.
Exactly.
For me, it's even almost, I got to have more evidence for the resurrection, because it's harder to have evidence for the resurrection than it was to prove that there is a God. And then I'm
Yeah.
like you, I don't just start off with the Christian God. I was like, oh, I'm just trying to get you to believe that there is a God. And to me, there's a lot more evidence to prove that there is a God before I can, and even trying to prove Christianity to this day. I mean, there's a lot of evidence, but most of it is eyewitness testimonies and circumstantial evidence, and
Yeah.
we don't have as much strong evidence as with just believing in God himself. So yeah, I'm with you on that one. So here's the tough question. This one's, and I'm not gonna lie, I steal from Frank Turek on this one because it's the best explanation I've ever heard. I just want to know if what you do. How do you explain the Trinity
Yeah.
when you're talking to people? How do you explain
Definitely
that?
not an easy question. It's hard to like, you got to be so careful talking about this because I don't want to like dive into heresy. Because it's a challenging question. I think what I start with is this idea that there's no contradiction. So like we have the basic doctrine of the Trinity, where we have one God, but then we have the three divine persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. And what I kind of think about is, okay, is this just logically possible? So I think when I look at the Trinity, I'm like, well, it doesn't violate the law of identity or non-contradiction, or the exclusive middle. Like, so I think it's logically possible that we have this kind of like Trinity. And then from there, we can kind of get into like, well, what does this all mean? And like social Trinitarianism or group Trinitarianism. And I just really have no idea. So it's just kind of like one of these things where I'm like, okay, well, it's logically possible. But then like, how do we get further and explain like why is God a Trinity? Well, I mean, like there's things like ideas such as like perfection. But at the end of the day, I don't know. It's just it's almost like a mystery to me. Like I think there's just really good reason to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And we get into this idea of the Trinity, and I think it's almost just a mystery. Even though there are people like I had an interview with Chad McIntosh, who's did a lot of work on this, and he thinks we can get to the Trinity through natural theology, which is really interesting. So I don't know. I don't know how to explain it. I think it's logically possible. And then from there, I don't know. It's not my job to have to explain every single inch of Christian dogma to you.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way. And I get a lot of people that comment on a lot of my videos and everything else. And really, when it boils down to it, they're just looking for me to persuade them instead of.
I almost wonder, like, okay, so let's like if we're talking with a Muslim, it'd be a little bit different than talking with, say, like an atheist about the Trinity. Okay, so like if we're talking with a Muslim, it'd be a little bit trickier because like we both believe God exists. But if we're gonna follow atheism all the way through, we're gonna have to say, okay, so we have these kind of like oppies, like brute facts, where we have like this certain amount of energy or matter that's shaped in this particular way, and that's just necessary. And it's a brute fact. And there could have been one more, there could have been one less, units or particles or whatever, but it's just a brute fact, and you can't explain that. So naturalism has its own kind of like brute fact where it can't explain. It's just like, okay, well, this is necessary. Or maybe if you want to say the infinite regress route, you can say, okay, well, the universe is past infinite, and that's just it. Well, it's like, okay, well, there's no explanation for that. So it seems like, at least for like the naturalists, they're going to also have this point where they can't explain something. So I think that, like, we can't just stop at like, well, the Christian can't explain something, so we just need to get rid of Christianity. Like, I don't know. I just don't really think that works.
I can hear you now. Yeah, I lost you
All
there for a
right.
second. Kind of everything kind of froze, but no, you're
Oh
back.
no. Good to hear we're
So,
back.
so have you ever heard like atheists, like argue the fact of morals, objective morality?
Mm-hmm.
So, do you think that most atheists, and this is just your opinion, I know you can't speak for atheists, but the ones that you have talked to and know, do you think deep down they honestly do believe in objective morality, but they just don't like to claim it because they know that's more evidence for God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Because I think there was the Phil paper survey that was done where they interviewed like all the philosophers. It was like 10 or 15 years ago. And it was like only like 15% of philosophers were theists, but over 50% were moral realists, where they like, like things like the Holocaust are just objectively wrong, regardless of like what individuals like you and me think about it. Which is really interesting because it seems like there's a good consent. There's a very solid group of people, including atheists, at least in philosophy, that are more realists and think that things are really wrong. So I think that most atheists, like, I don't want to like put words into their mouth because that's, I want to avoid that. But I think most people would agree that there's this very strong intuition with regards to morality. Like it just seems intuitively obvious that things like rape or murder are just wrong. So it seems intuitively obvious, and I don't think many people would deny that. And how do we get to like moral realism? Well, if like we're gonna follow naturalism all the way through, I really don't know how we get there. Like there's people like Eric Williamberg that would defend like a naturalistic picture of objective morality, but I just don't know. So, I mean, I think that very strong intuition's there, but I think a lot of these atheists are like, well, okay, if I'm going to follow naturalism all the way through, I don't know how we get to there being objective morality. But I mean, I think the intuitive force of it is very evident. If that kind of answers your question.
So, in your opinion, do you believe the entire Bible is true and is the authoritative word of God? Like the
Yeah,
entire thing?
yeah, I think that like when we interpret the Bible correctly, yeah, it's the authoritative word of God, and whatever it teaches is true, and the key is interpret it correctly. So yeah, short answer there. Yeah, I think I'd agree there.
Yeah, you're exactly right, though. It's the way, as long as it's interpreted correctly. And I
Hmm.
think that's a thing, even with a lot of Christians, I think that's something that is what's really going on with a lot of Christians is that they will read the Bible for face value for what it's worth, but none of them actually study it. They never actually study it, and I've always loved to study it. I got a degree in theology from the Gordon Conwell Seminary. I've gone through Biola for apologetics, and I tell people all the time, I'm like, and I'm still learning things. Like there's things I still learn on a daily basis. That's why I keep researching and everything else. But I just think it's amazing how many people don't actually study. Like,
Hmm.
and to me, it's like when you come across a verse that you're just like, well, that sounds really wrong of God to do that. That don't sound like he should be doing that.
Hmm.
Well, then, that's when you should start reading it and start trying to study it in its natural, either Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic, however whatever it's written in, and learn what it said. Because when they translated all this, a lot of times they just picked the word that they knew best at the time. In
Hmm.
fact, me and my wife, we do a Bible study twice a week, just me and her, and we just talked about oh man, what was it? Oh, when Jesus was saying kingdom will rise against kingdom, nation will rise against nation. And he was talking about the end world, like some of the signs that will be coming. And she says, well, that's exactly where we're at, nation against nation. I'm like, actually, we've been there for a while.
Hmm.
And I was trying to explain to her, I'm like, see, you gotta understand. I'm like, back in the day when this was written, they didn't have countries. They were kingdoms. That's what they
Hmm.
were. And I was telling her, I'm like, nation was actually meaning race. That's the actual word that was meant there was race. And I'm like, so if you think about it, we've been race against race, since I was young, of course, now, of course, everything just gets worse and worse, and everybody has this, I'm offended by everything mentality. But even back in the 50s, 60s, and before, there was race against race.
Mhm.
And I told her, I was like, why do you, that's why it says nation. I was like, because nation is just short for nationality. That's what it's trying to say. I'm like, but now when it's talking about kingdom, that's like the US against China, Russia, those are kingdoms. I'm
Yeah.
like, so, and it's just, and I'm not saying that's a big thing, but it's just little things. I'm like, people need to
Mhm.
study it because they don't, they just
Oh,
misinterpret it.
yeah.
And like, people just don't understand that, when all this was written, I mean, basically where we get our Bible from is from the Septuagint, or I don't even know how to pronounce it right. The
Septuagint, yeah.
there we go.
Very
And I was like,
confusing Greek word.
yes, it is. And I told her, but I was like, the number of books we get come from the Masoretic text. And so I was trying to explain to her which each one comes from.
Mhm.
And I was like, that's what separates the Jews from Christians and everything else. But I was like, you got to think how long ago that was written. I was like, they didn't have half the words we have nowadays. I'm like, you're trying to use first century world words in a 21st century world. You got to translate it. You got to do a
Yeah.
lot of studying. And I'm like, people don't read a math book and be like, I'm ready for the test. No, you study
Yeah.
it. You have to study these kind of things. And when it comes to your salvation, I just think that I'm like, really, you don't want to study that? I mean, you should really want to study this. Out of
Yeah.
anything you study, this should be the best thing you study.
Mhm.
Okay, let's see. What was my next question? So, what do you think the best way to approach an atheist is about Jesus? Because I have this issue, because, like I said, I'm very blunt and I'm forward. And I think
Mhm.
a lot of times I come across wrong to people, and I'm not trying to.
Mhm.
And I obviously don't want to push them away from God.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm trying to do. But
Mhm.
I honestly don't. I don't have like a good way to approach them without it sounding like
Yeah.
I'm attacking them.
I think it's tricky. Because it's so hard. Like I've noticed myself, like we're in the midst of like a heated debate with an atheist, and like all we're trying to do is like, disprove their point and like debunk their argument. Da, 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 da. But I really like Josh Rasmussen's approach to this, where it's not like he approaches it where like when we're engaging with like an atheist or a skeptic, like it's so easy to get into this idea of like it's me versus them, but it's almost like it's got to be like me and them. Like I almost hope that like when I'm engaging with an atheist, it's almost like, hey, we're in this together. We should both be seeking truth. Like, like we shouldn't just be here to prove the other person wrong, but actually like enter into a conversation where we're trying to learn from each other and really try to figure out like what's true. So I think that's the best approach. I mean, the atheists that I've encountered have always, as far as I know, have thought that I've had good conduct. So I think it's just about keeping an open mind, and just be willing to seek truth with them and just like exploring these ideas together. I think it's hard to like in like one debate or one conversation to convince someone that God exists or that Jesus rose from the dead. I'm working on my thesis on C.S. Lewis, and like it took him a long time to get from, well, there's no God to, okay, there might be a God to there's a God to Christian theism. Like it took a long time. So I almost think like in these conversations, it should be about trying to like work together to like maybe make a new discovery, even if it's like a very minimal thing. So it's really hard because like when you're in the thick of the debate, it's like, I gotta get this other guy and prove him wrong. And I'm guilty of that so many times. But I mean, like trying to almost make it like we're working together is probably my preferred way of going about it. If possible, if I can try to remind myself to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think my biggest problem is like, I don't know how long I have with this person.
Hmm.
So I want to get out everything I can.
Hmm.
And then it's, after I'm done, I sit back and I think, and I'm like, I should never brought up like any of this other stuff,
Yeah.
because there's no way they're going to remember everything I just said to them. I'm like, I
Mm.
should have just kept with one thing and stayed with it until they changed the conversation.
Hmm.
But I think that's my biggest problem personally. I
Yeah.
think I
I
just,
yeah, I'll get messages and emails from people and they'll just be like 8 different points. And I'm like, oh my gosh, how do we start this? And like instead of getting these massive email threads, like, okay, let's just take this one issue at a time and look at this one specific thing. And I've always found that to be a great approach when addressing these questions.
so even when they come to you with like 8 different questions, you just try to stick to one or two of the bigger
Hmm.
ones. And
Yeah. I try to be like, hey, I'm willing to work through you with all these, but let's just look at it one at a time and slow it down. It's kind of my preferred approach. So yeah.
Right. So obviously, like I said, I got kids. I don't know how old you are, but my youngest is like 23 years old. She just turned 23. My oldest is 30. But anyways, what I've come to notice is that atheists and nowadays, like the younger generation atheists, and I'm just saying my opinion, to me, it doesn't seem as if they don't believe in God. It's really as if they just hate God, but yet they want to claim atheism. They're like, "Oh, I'm atheist. I don't believe in God." But yet, when they make stated questions, it's like, you really sound like you really hate this guy. And it's kind of like what Frank Turek said about Christopher Hitchinson. I don't know if you ever saw their debate, but like at the end of the debate, he said, basically what you're saying is, I don't believe in God, but I hate him. And I'm like, that's exactly how these younger generations are. Like a lot of, I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them, I'm like, yeah, sound like y'all are just hating God, because I watch a lot of the YouTube videos, like I said, and most of them aren't atheist against Muslims, atheist against, this religion, Buddha, any other religion. It's really towards the Christian God, a lot of it. And I'm like, I don't know if it's just because we live in America, and that's just America. Well, America used to be a really big Christian nation. I don't know what it is now, but it just seems like to me they hate God. No, it's not so much that they don't believe in him.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, because every person's different, and every atheist has their own story, and they're a person. They have their own reasons for rejecting Christianity or what's not. I think it's probably commonly like Christianity is commonly addressed because that's the predominant like religion in like the West. But then like with like my personal experience, like I'm thinking about like my friends and the people I know with my generation that are atheists. I think it's what they view Christianity as almost. And I think it's a rejection of, I think it's like they might not like Christian morals, like they don't want to follow Christian morals. I think that's definitely a part of it, but it's like what they see Christianity as, and they almost see it as like this tool that was used to control people. Like, like LGBT rights is a really big thing right now. And it's like, well, religion is just something that people use to try to control these people. So it's not really rejecting it for like the truth value of it. It's rejecting it because they think of it as just this tool that people used. And we should just do whatever we want, or something along these lines. So I mean, obviously every person is different. And I think like the person that's like consuming like YouTube atheist videos will have a more robust version of atheism than like the random person off the street that just doesn't believe. So I think there's definitely those people out there that just hate God, but I think there's just people that think that maybe, religion is just something that was used to control people, or something along those lines, missing the mark of like what Christianity is supposed to be. So it's tricky because there's what, like a billion atheists out there, and each person has their own story. So it's kind of like the general thoughts on this challenging question.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, the only thing I could come up with, and I could be totally wrong with this, but the only thing I could come up with is just, and nowadays, it's like everything's a cancel culture. Like you can't tell people anything what they're doing is wrong anymore, or you're going to face backlash, getting sued, going to jail, for anything that you speak up against. And I think to me, that's what I think is atheism is kind of on the rise, because they're like, well, I don't like people telling us what to do. And so,
I also think, yeah. I also think that there's been a lot of non-believers throughout most of history. Like, like up until like 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, like you couldn't really come out and be an ex-Christian because of like the deep ties of like the Christian religion throughout society. Like if you look at like the medieval period, like there's a lot of people that just are living like people that live today in terms of like not being Christian, sleeping around or what's not. Like I've been reading this book about like Renaissance Rome, and it's a mess. So I think this like culture of like non-belief and wanting to do stuff has always been around, but I think now within the past like 20 or 30 years, like atheism's been destigmatized, and it's like, oh, you're not like, like if you said it maybe like the 1970s, like if you're an atheist, well, you're a communist. And that was kind of like the way it was. But now it's like, okay, well, you can be accepted and be an atheist, which is the way, like, obviously, like, to the atheists that might be listening, is like, I disagree with you on so many things, but you should be accepted. Like, we shouldn't like force you to like hide in a corner and not say anything just because you're an atheist. So just kind of my thoughts. Sorry to interrupt there.
Oh, no, you're good. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And honestly, I tell people all the time, I'm like, to me, the reason there's so many atheists is we got to blame it on ourselves. You got to blame it on the Christians because, like you were saying, I want to say up to about 30 or 40 years ago, see, before then, Christians were constantly speaking about God in the public, everywhere they went, talking about him and just going around. But then it was like, I don't know what happened 30 or 40 years ago, but it's like Christians are like, oh, we better just huddle in the church and let's just keep God in the church and, and everything else. And then all of a sudden now the church is wanting to come, the people want to come out of the church and they're like, where did all these atheists come from? And I'm like, well, there's nobody been around to tell them anything different.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been hiding with their head in the sand in the church, I'm like, so we have no one to blame but ourselves. That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
So, all right, well, our time here is about up. So is there anything else that you would like anybody to know about you? And if you want, I'm going to put your YouTube channel, if any kind of social media platforms, I'll put it down at the bottom because I'm going to do this on YouTube and it's going to go on my podcast as well. It's going to go on both. So I'm going to do both. But is there anything else you'd like anybody to know? How to find you? Anything?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate your time. It's been such a fun conversation talking about so many important things. And if you just like want to follow like my content and stuff, you just look up Adherent Apologetics, whether it's on like YouTube or podcast or Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Be sure to follow along, and we're just going to seek truth and ask big questions and just all for God's glory. So thank you so much for having me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Man, it's been great having you, honestly. I really liked your answers. Some of them got me really thinking. I'm like, I can use a lot of that. I mean, I'm an older man, but I'll admit if somebody has a good idea, and I'm like, that's a good idea. I don't care how old you are.
You're not that old,
I'm not that young. Tomorrow's my birthday.
Happy 25th birthday, 30th birthday.
That sounds good. That sounds great. That sounds great. I wish my health said the same. But no, it was great talking to you. But You have a good one, buddy. I appreciate talking to you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. For sure. Have a good one. Goodbye.
Bye.